continuing with the topic Unsafe Act Auditing. Unsafe Act Auditing. Now, what is Unsafe Act Auditing? When we talk about Unsafe Act Auditing, we are simply referring to the programs, those programs designed by organization or company to enable them identify those unsafe acts that workers exhibit in their workplace. Unsafe Act Auditing is a program designed to identify unsafe acts of workers in their place of work. Now, why unsafe act auditing? Is simply to help prevent accidents or hazards in the place of work. We'll be looking at the objective of this Unsafe Act Auditing. One of the objectives of Unsafe Act Auditing is to increase safety awareness among workers. One of the objectives of Unsafe Act Auditing is to increase safety awareness among workers in their workplace. Second objective of Unsafe Act Auditing is to ensure that safety standards is being adhered to in workplace. When we talk about safety standards, we're talking about those safety principles set by organizations and the safety bodies to ensure that they are being adhered to in the course of discharge of duties in the workplace. Another objective of Unsafe Act Auditing is to promote communication and understanding of safety in the workplace, to promote communication and understanding, and also ensure effective use of resources in the workplace or in the business. Another objective of Unsafe Act Auditing is to motivate employee. In the course of Unsafe Act Auditing, when a worker is found to be adhering to safety standards, such a worker will be given adequate reward, thereby encouraging or motivating such employee towards ensuring adherence to safety standards in the workplace. Now we'll look at unsafe acts and condition in the workplace. What is unsafe act? Unsafe acts are simply those actions of workers in their workplace that can cause injury, harm to a worker or that of his colleagues in the workplace. Those actions, those unsafe actions of workers in their workplace is what we refer to as unsafe act. And then unsafe practice is simply a conduct. Those unsafe conduct, whether witnessed or unwitnessed, that are being carried out by workers in their workplace. Another term we'll look at as regarding unsafe act auditing is what we call safety principles or facts. When we talk about safety principles or facts, we are talking about those safety slogans, if you choose to call it that way, or safety guidelines, or rather principles in unsafe act auditing. One of those safety principles is that safety has equal priority with procedure. And the second one is that all accidents, all injuries and occupational illness can be controlled. All accidents, injuries, occupational hazards can be controlled. Safety training observation program, known as STOP, helps to ensure that these principles are put into action. Safety training observation program, abbreviated as STOP, ensures or helps to put safety principles into action. Another safety principle is called safe work practice should be enforced in all unsafe acts and unsafe conditions. Safe work practices should be enforced, and all unsafe acts and unsafe practices must be corrected. Now, when we talk about unsafe activity, there are things we need to know regarding unsafe activity. And one of them is what we call the on-the-job training. In carrying out unsafe activity, we need to do what we call on-the-job training as part of unsafe act auditing. Now, what is on-the-job training? On-the-job training simply means auditing those, carrying out training in the course of a person's job. While the person is carrying out the job, doing the job, you do what we call a training on the job. That is it, before the job begins. When someone has been given a task, after a period of time, or after a period of being on that particular job, there is need for training as part of unsafe act auditing. So unsafe act auditing is part of on-the-job training. So when you want to carry out on-the-job training, unsafe act auditing is part of on-the-job training. And then on-the-job training gives a worker a chance to practice what he has learned in order to prevent injury and improve safety performance in the workplace. Now we look at the techniques for conducting unsafe act auditing. What are the techniques for conducting unsafe act auditing? One is preparation. Preparation has to do with preparing the employees, the workers, creating awareness, informing them. For the program. They should be informed of the objectives of the program, the methodology to be used, and also the benefits of this unsafe act auditing as regarding their workplace, towards ensuring that safety is being acknowledged. Now, a second technique of conducting unsafe act auditing is what we call observation. Observation. Observation has to do with going to a particular location where a worker is carrying out his or her task and then observing those unsafe acts being exhibited by a worker. You look at the amount of time to be spent and the areas to cover should also be determined in observation. The areas are to be determined and the amount of time you're going to spend in carrying out the observation should be determined beforehand. And in carrying out unsafe act auditing, you need to visit a worker in the course of his job, in the course of carrying out his job, and then make your observations. You make your findings. So in carrying out observation, there's what we call the observation cycle. To carry out observation effectively, we have to follow the observation cycle. One of the observation cycle, one is to observe, two is to decide, three you stop, act, and then report. I'll take it again. The observation cycle in unsafe act auditing. The first step is to observe. You decide, you stop, you act, and then you report. How do you carry out this? You decide to carry out unsafe act auditing. And by doing that, you visit a worker in the course of his duty. Then observe what he or she does, those unsafe acts. And then decide to act on those unsafe acts. And then report. Make your report. Documentation. For example, you visit a worker in the course of his duty or discharging his task, and you observe that the worker is not putting on PPE. It's part of your report. That is after acting. So you observe, you decide, you stop, you act, and then you report. And then carrying out that, not just looking at the PPE, there are also other areas you can look at as regarding observation of a worker in response to unsafe act auditing. You can also look at the position of people during their work. Look at their position, their body posture at their workplace. Is their posture good? Are they safe? Does their posture have any health implications? Those are the things you observe. Remember, you act, you also make your report. So in doing this, you apply what we call the questioning approach. We have the questioning approach, we have the equipment, the tools of equipment, we have the procedures, and the orderliness. And I also have the discussions. In unsafe act auditing, we have the tools, the equipment, the procedures, we have the discussions, we have the implementation, and then we have the follow-up. And remember, unsafe act auditing is very important in every organization. Unsafe act auditing is very important in every organization. The importance of unsafe act auditing cannot be overemphasized. If organization stays for a longer period of time without conducting unsafe act auditing or without implementing this program of unsafe act auditing, I can assure you there will be frequent unsafe acts being carried out by workers, which can also lead to accidents, hazards, and so on. In conclusion, unsafe act auditing constitutes a very useful tool in preventing accidents. Unsafe act auditing constitutes a very useful tool in preventing accidents. When you carry out unsafe act auditing, you are directly or indirectly controlling accidents or putting accident preventive measures in place. Management should introduce and sustain in all the organization or company's operations. Management should introduce and sustain unsafe act auditing in their operation, in their daily operation. Employees are to be encouraged to cooperate and participate in the conduct of unsafe act auditing. They should be encouraged to participate and also to cooperate to unsafe act auditing. The company as well as employees stand to gain if they regularly conduct unsafe act auditing in their work sites. When unsafe act auditing is being constantly conducted in the place of work or in the work site, it goes a long way towards ensuring that accidents is minimized in the workplace. We'll proceed to our fire safety. Fire safety. Fire safety is one of the cause in health, safety, and environment that one has to be sensitive to. If an organization experiences a fire outbreak, of course, you believe with me that all the assets, both tangible and intangible, will be out of place within a twinkle of an eye. That's to let you know how important this course, fire safety, is. Before we proceed, we'll look at what is fire. We hear of the word every day, fire. Fire is simply defined as a chemical reaction between fuel, heat, and oxygen. Fire is a chemical reaction between fuel, heat, and oxygen. And then these three components form what we call the fire triangle. Just like in mathematics, where you have of course, you know, a triangle has three sides. Let me put it with that, use that scenario. One of the sides is fuel, the other side is oxygen, and the other side is heat. And then inside the triangle is fire. What it simply means is that those three components surrounding the triangle needs to be in the right proportion before fire can occur. We are going to be taking them one after another. We look at what is fuel. Fuel is not simply the one we know of in the fuel station. No, when we talk about fuel, it's not limited to fuel station. The one you know you get in fuel station. Anything that can burn is fuel. Paper, cardboard, wood, foam, name them. They are all fuel. If it can burn, it is fuel. Including the clothes, materials, they are all fuel. If it can burn, it's fuel. And then heat. Heat is simply a source of ignition. For a fire to take place, heat has to be in place. And then the next one is oxygen. Of course, oxygen is provided by the presence of air. And without oxygen, of course, there won't be fire. And one thing we have to note here at this point is that before a fire can occur, these three components need to be in the right proportion. I'm talking about the fuel, the oxygen, and then the heat. Not just the presence of the three, they have to be in the right proportion before fire can take place. Let's look at the sources of heat. In the workplace, naked flames is a source of heat. There are sources of fuel. Of course, there are many of them. When we talk about sources of fuel, they can be categorized into three: the solid, liquid, and the gas. Those are the common ones. Talk about the solid fuel, let me put it that way, the liquid fuel and the gaseous fuel. When we talk about the solid fuel, we are talking about paper, which I mentioned earlier, wood, foam. They are all categorized under solid fuel. And then the liquid fuel. Liquid fuel are things like paint, chemicals, and so on and so forth. They are liquid fuel. And then gaseous fuel. Of course, gaseous fuel, when we talk about gaseous fuel, we are talking about those liquefied petroleum gas found in cylinders. You can see them in cylinders, usually made of butane and propane. They are all gaseous fuel. And then source of oxygen, which we observed earlier, is carried out or is helped by the presence of air. So oxygen, of course, is provided by air. We'll go further to look at the classification of fire. Classification of fire. Fire can be classified into different categories. And that's what we'll be looking at this time. And this classification of fire is simply based on the fuel and the means of extinguishing them. They are categorized based on the fuel, that is what is burning, and then their means of extinguishing. So there are 5 main classes of fire. We have the class A fire, the class B fire, which is sub-categorized into B1 and B2. We have the class C fire, the class D fire, and the class F fire. We'll start with the class A fire. The class A fire are fires which involve solid materials. When we talk about class A fire, we are talking about those solid materials that can burn, such as wood, paper, textiles, plastics, etc. They are categorized as class A fire, or they are under class A fire. And they can be extinguished by cooling. This type of fire, talking about the class A fire, can be extinguished by cooling. Before the end of the topic, I will still emphasize on the methods of extinguishing fire, where I would elaborate more on cooling, starvation, and the rest. But for now, we'll go further to the classification of fire. We have the class B fire. The class B fire are fires which involve liquids or liquefied solids. Fires which involve liquids or liquefied solids is referred to as class B fire. This fire can be subdivided into two. They can be subdivided into two: the B1, the class B1, and the class B2. The class B1 are fires which involve liquids that are soluble in water. Class B1 are fires that involve materials that involve liquids that are soluble in water. Example is methanol. And then the class B2 fire, the class B2 involve liquids that are non-soluble in water. An example of it is petrol. We'll go further to class C fire. The class C fire are fires which involve gases, such as natural gas, and they can be extinguished using the foam or dry powder. This type of fire can be extinguished using dry powder. Of course, you know dry powder can be used to extinguish any kind of fire. And then furthermore, we'll look at the class D fire. The class D fire. Class D fire are fires which involve metals such as aluminium or magnesium. They are fires which involve metals such as aluminium or magnesium. Now, how do we extinguish this type of fire? Talking about the class D fire. We can extinguish it using the dry powder as well. It can be extinguished using dry powder. And then we'll look at class E fire. The class E fire are what we call the electrical fire. The class E fire is what we call the electrical fire. The class E fire is what we call the electrical fire. Though they are not formally categorized, they are not formally classified anywhere, but we'll call them the electrical fires. And these are fires which involve high temperature cooking oils. They are fires that involve high temperature cooking oils and fats. You can see that in a catering place where they offer catering services. That's where you can see this kind of electrical fire. The class F fire. I beg your pardon. Class E fire is classified as electrical fires, while class F fire is regarded as fires that occurs as a result of high temperature cooking oils. And the class F fire is the type of fire you see in catering services, whereby you can see them frying, and then the oil, because of the heat, can see the fire being transferred to the oil because of the high temperature. Then you see the oil being on flame, burning. I believe most of you might have experienced that while frying in their various kitchens. It's not limited to catering services alone. And you can also see that in our individual homes. I believe most people have experienced that kind of fire. We'll classify it under class F fire. And then I will further elaborate on the class E fire, which is the electrical fire. So the electrical fire are fires which involve electrical equipment. There are fire which involve electrical equipment or circuit. And this kind of fire can be extinguished by what we call starvation. Electrical fire can be extinguished by starving. What do you mean by that? For example, when there is a fire outbreak caused by electricity, how to extinguish that kind of fire is simply by starving. What do you mean by that? Simply locate the control switch where the source of the electricity entered, and then switch it off. Once you've done that, you have starved the fire, and then by so doing, you might have extinguished the fire. At least, if not totally, at least by 80 to 90%. And then we move further to principles of heat transmission. Someone might be saying, what brought about principles of heat transmission in fire safety? Or remember when we talk about the fire triangle, we made mention of the three components that will be in place before fire can occur. And one of them, if you can remember vividly, we made mention of heat. That's where it comes in. There are three of them: the heat, the fuel, and the oxygen. So we look at the principles of heat transmission and fire spread. One is by convection. We have the conduction, we have the radiation, and then we have the direct burning. These are the four major principles of heat transmission and fire spread. Either through convection, through conduction, through radiation, or through direct burning. We'll proceed to look at the causes of fire. What are the various causes of fire? One of it is combustible materials. Combustible materials can easily trigger fire. And remember, when we talk about combustible materials, we are talking about those things that can easily burn, like paper materials, plastics. Name them. They are all combustible materials. Your paper, your wood, cardboard, etc. Anything that can easily burn is regarded as combustible material. We have the foam, the oil rags, and so on and so forth. And then another cause of fire, which is number 2, is the flammable materials. The flammable materials. Flammable materials, they are simply unsafe use of storage, dispensing. Okay, flammable materials. When we talk about flammable, let me start from there. We'll talk about flammable. Of course, most of us have been heard about the word flammable and inflammable. We'll talk about flammable materials. They are those source of fire that can cause explosion. Those source of fire that can cause explosion. When you say something is flammable, that thing can easily explode. That's what we mean by that. That's why in most of the spray cans that most people use in their various houses, talking about the body spray, the perfumes, some of those things are flammable. When you read the labels, you see what we are talking about. And in such cases, caution has to be applied when disposing such items, because they can easily explode. They are flammable. The reason being that they contain butane and propane. The next cause of fire, which is number 3, is electrical issues. Electrical issues. That's another cause of fire. This type of fire is caused by faulty electrical equipment, extension cords, wall sockets, faulty electrical cables. Name them. They all comprise electrical issues which can trigger fire. Wrong connections. There are so many of them. So extension cords, multiple plug adapters, placing heaters close to combustible materials. Your heater, you plug and then place it close to combustible materials. And before you know it, there will be transmission of heat. And then the next thing is fire outbreak. We have damaged wiring and the rest. They all comprise of electrical or can cause electrical fire. The next cause of fire is the hot work, or called hot work. This type of fire is caused by operation involving heated materials or open flames. They are caused by materials or operation involving heated materials, whereby materials are being heated at a very high temperature. We refer to that as a hot work. And that can pose fire hazard. The next cause of fire is the machine and equipment. The machine and equipment. Talking about machine and equipment, I'm talking about faulty machines, or when some machines or equipment are not lubricated properly. They can become a cause of fire. Some materials, some machines rather, and equipment with electrical faults, electrical problems, can also be a source of or a cause of fire. That is under machines and equipment. When the electrical part of machines or those equipment is faulty, it can cause fire. Then waste materials, trash, scrap, can also be another cause of fire. When those items are allowed to accumulate in large proportion, it can pose a risk of fire. Can pose a risk of fire, or it can increase the risk of fire in such cases. And then another cause of fire, which is actually the last, is the careless smoking. Is another cause of fire that is mostly being neglected or ignored. When a smoker finishes smoking and then threw away the debris or remnants of the cigarette, not knowing that cigarette, there's still light on it. And once that cigarette comes in contact with any combustible materials, the next thing is fire outbreak. So careless smoking is one of the cause of fire. And apart from that, when someone is smoking in places that are restricted, it can also be a cause of fire. It can also trigger fire. That's why when you go to places like fuel stations, smoking is not allowed here. The reason being that smoking in that particular environment can easily trigger fire, since they have some inflammable material, inflammable gases or fuels, as you may call them, in such areas. That's why when you go there, you see smoking signs. Then you see them enforcing smoking signs everywhere, not allowed. We'll proceed further to fire risk assessment. Fire risk assessment. Of course, fire risk assessment is the assessment of those fire risk areas. Assessing those things that can become a risk of fire in an organization or in a company. Now, after carrying out that fire risk assessment, a preventive measure or control measure has also to be put in place. That's why after carrying out fire risk assessment procedure, you will see things like safety signs, exit signs in the case of emergency, fire alarm, fire extinguishers, and major areas, key entry areas. Those safety signs or fire signs or preventive measures, control measures are being put in place after a thorough fire risk assessment. And they also serve as control measures towards fire outbreak. So we look at the stages of fire risk assessment. There are various stages in carrying out fire risk assessment. Number one is to identify fire hazards. Before you can carry out fire risk assessment, you have to go from department to department, from one work area to another. As you are going, you identify the fire risk areas. Some work locations, some departments in organizations are prone to fire hazards more than others. So in carrying out fire risk assessment, you take note of those ones with high tendency or that have high rate of fire hazards occurring in such department, and then put adequate measures or control measures in place. The second stage of fire risk assessment is to identify location and persons who are at significant risk. Identify locations and persons or workers who are at significant risk. In fire risk assessment, after you've identified the hazards, the next thing you identify is the locations that is at more risk than others. The persons or the workers at more risk than others. That will help you put control measures in place. And of course, those ones who are at more risk than others, more priority will be given to them regarding control measures to ensure their safety. And also recovery measures has to be put in place. Not just control measures, recovery measures as well. And then the number 3, the third stage of carrying out fire risk assessment is to reduce the risk. After you've identified those hazards, you've identified locations and persons at high risk, what do you do next? You try as much as you can to reduce the risk. How do you reduce this risk? You put in place signs, safety signs, fire alarms, fire extinguishers, firefighting equipment, fire exit routes. Those are the means by which you can reduce the risk in such location. And then stage 4 is that you record your findings. You record findings. After you've identified the hazards, you've identified the fire hazard or fire risk, you identify the locations and persons at more risk than others, you reduce the risk. The next thing you do is to record your findings. And then, lastly, those findings should be reviewed from time to time. Those findings should be reviewed from time to time. You monitor and review on a regular basis. Fire risk assessment is not a once and for all procedure. It's not a once and for all procedure. There is need to review, to monitor on a regular basis. You review it on a regular basis. The reason being that one location might have a high fire risk today, and in the next review, you might discover that a different location is now on a higher risk than the previous location. And imagine what will happen when there is no review. The person might be taken, or the organization might be taken for pride. So in reviewing, you monitor and review on a regular basis. The fire risk assessment should be monitored and reviewed on a regular basis. And then fire plans should be produced and attached to the risk assessment. Fire plans should be produced and attached to the fire assessment. And a copy should also be posted at the workplace. The reason for that is to create awareness among workers, especially those at the high risk areas, so that they can trade with caution and to put all necessary precautions in place when working in such areas. Now, elements of fire prevention. We look at the elements of fire prevention. You list all major fire hazards. Proper control of hazardous materials. No smoking should be displayed and enforced in work locations that are prone to or that have high risk of fire. Work permits should be obtained before any welding job is to be carried out or executed in such areas. Of course, we've discussed earlier on what permit to work is. So in a case whereby there is need for welding in such areas that has a high risk of fire, there is need for permit to work to be obtained before carrying out a welding job in such areas or in such facility. All equipment should be provided for waste, particularly those with petroleum products. That are those that has high combustion rate. It should be separated on a separate waste. While those with low combustible rates can be separated on a different waste bin. That will go a long way to control risk of fire. In the sense that those that has high combustible rates, like petroleum products, those oily rags, can be kept in waste bins that are far away from whatever that can trigger fire outbreak, possibly from heat. We'll look at methods of extinguishing fire. The methods of fire extinguisher. Fire extinguisher. How do we extinguish fire? We have three methods of extinguishing fire. There are three methods of extinguishing fire. Number one is by cooling. Cooling has to do with reducing the temperature, the ignition temperature of the heat. Example, using water. We can achieve cooling using water. For example, when a wood is burning as a source of fuel, you can easily extinguish it using water, and that can be achieved. That is a method called cooling. You use the water to cool the fuel, and by so doing, you've extinguished the fire. The second method of extinguishing fire is what we call smoothing. Smoothing has to do with the use of fire extinguishers. It has to do with limiting the oxygen available by using fire extinguisher. We are using fire extinguisher and limiting the oxygen in the fire, thereby extinguishing the fire. Of course, you remember earlier on, we said oxygen is part of the thing that can cause, that will be in the right proportion before fire can take place. We mentioned of oxygen, heat, and fuel. So when the oxygen is being limited, the fire can't continue. And remember, when one of them is not in place, there won't be fire. In the absence of oxygen and the presence of heat and fuel, fire can't take place. And at the same time, in the absence of fuel and the presence of oxygen and heat, there won't be fire as well. So when you take any of them out of the equation, there won't be any fire. So smoothing has to do with removing the oxygen or limiting the oxygen, thereby extinguishing the fire. And that can be done using fire extinguisher. And then the last method of fire extinguishing is what we call starvation. Starving. Yes, starving. You starve the fire. How do you starve the fire? You limit the fuel supply. When you limit the fuel supply, you have starved the fire. Example. Removing the source of fuel. For example, in electrical fire. Electrical fire can be extinguished using what we call starvation. As I said earlier on, starving has to do with switching off the control switch, the source of the electricity. Once you've done that, you have starved the fire. And by so doing, you have achieved your aim of extinguishing the fire. A real life scenario of starvation, for a better understanding. If you have ever cooked with firewood and then you want to starve the fire, the simple way of starving the fire is by removing the firewood, separating them one after the other, remove them from the fire. And before you know it, the fire is down. That's an example of starvation. To bring it down to a general understanding. So it's not just only in electrical fire, it can also be applied in other means. But it works effectively better in the case of electrical fire. Now, in the use of fire extinguisher, when you look at the fire extinguisher, you see the acronym PASS. P-A-S-S, PASS. Now, each of these abbreviations has their own meaning. P stands for pull. A stands for aim. S stands for squeeze. And the other S stands for sweep. So as you pull the pin, you aim at the fire, the base of the fire, and then you smooth and sweep from side to side. And by so doing, you've extinguished the fire. that is how to effectively use the fire extinguisher. Remember, when fire extinguisher is not effectively used, it can't serve its purpose. It has to be followed in that order: pull, aim, and squeeze, while moving from side to side. And in conclusion, we have different types of fire extinguisher. We have the carbon, we have the carbon dioxide, we have the foam, we have the water, and then we have the dry powder. These are the 4 types of fire extinguishers. I'll go over them again. Number 1 is water extinguishers or pressurized water extinguishers. Number 2, carbon dioxide extinguishers. Number 3, dry powder or dry chemical fire extinguisher. So these are the basic types of fire extinguisher. We'll take the last course for today before we can call it a day. After which I will take questions before we end the course. We'll look at good housekeeping. Good housekeeping. Of course, when you go to some hospitality industries, you have a department called housekeeping. Of course, their duty is the same thing as this course. What is their role in the hospitality industry? The role or the duty of the housekeepers is to simply make sure that the rooms are clean and they are tidied. The bed sheets, everything is washed, everywhere is cleaned up, tidied up. And the same case applies here. Good housekeeping entails general cleanliness and tidiness around the workplace. The difference is that it's not just limited to indoor in the case of hospitality industries. Here it is versatile. It can be indoor, it can be outdoor. Provided it's a workplace, good housekeeping has to do with general cleanliness and tidiness of the workplace, whether it's indoor or outdoor. So a good housekeeping entails removing litters, dirt, trash from the work site, removing all scraps, salvageable materials, broken or unused parts, and then disposing them properly. Housekeeping also entails cleaning up oil, water, paint in the workplace. When oil is littered or water is on the floor in the workplace and then is not properly cleaned up, we can say there is no good housekeeping in such work environment. So removing and keeping all bolts, nuts, spanners, hammer, and the rest of them is also part of a good housekeeping. So how do we maintain a good housekeeping? I'll go through it quickly. How do we maintain good housekeeping? We maintain good housekeeping through general cleanliness. We maintain good housekeeping by ensuring initial standards do not drop. When we talk about initial standards, we're talking about initial safety standards. Making sure that you don't go below the safety standards. And a good housekeeping also, how to maintain a good housekeeping. The next one is to ensure that there are no particles in the surface of gangways. There's no obstacles. There's no barrier in gangways, in entry points. How to maintain a good housekeeping again is to keep floors and everywhere well tidied. Another one is to make sure that lighting is adequate in the workplace. Of course, when there is no adequate lighting, there can be issues of injuries. There can be issues of falling. And in such a case, injuries or accidents might follow. And how to maintain good housekeeping again is to dump all waste directly into the waste bin. As we mentioned earlier, those that have combustible materials, they should be disposed on a separate waste bin. Those that are non-combustible materials on a separate. The reason being that those that are combustible materials can be taken to a safer location where they can be far away from heat or things that can trigger fire. And then we'll look at next. The next thing we'll look at today is the benefits of good housekeeping. Benefits of good housekeeping. One of the benefits of good housekeeping is greater efficiency. There is a greater efficiency in terms of productivity in the workplace. Then elimination of accidents. When there is adequate good housekeeping, the workplace is safe and free from accidents. As a matter of fact, accident can be eradicated or eliminated 100%. And then improved morale. It will improve the morale of workers in the sense that accidents will hardly occur. And then increased rate of production. There will be increased rate of production, which invariably, if there is a case of accident, the reverse will be the case. And then quicker access. It will enable workers to have a quicker access into the workplace, especially when they have work-free space. But when things are littered all over the work site or the workplace, getting access to a particular workplace or work site becomes difficult, since there won't be much space. A worker will have to squeeze him or herself to a particular site, and then that makes accessing or getting access to that particular place more difficult. And then space economy is the next one. Space economy. Good housekeeping will help to utilize space. A place where a work site that is littered cannot be compared to the space where a work site that is well arranged. When you compare the two of them, the work site that maintain a good housekeeping and the one that does not maintain a good housekeeping, of course you know the difference. The one with good housekeeping will have more workspace than the other, because the things are being arranged and stacked in order, thereby creating enough space for work and also access or quicker access into the work location or work environment. Especially when one is looking for a particular item or a file, it makes it easier when those things are very stacked, are arranged in order. It makes work very easier in accessing a particular tool or equipment or file, as the case may be. So ensuring a good housekeeping. To ensure a good housekeeping, authorities are to set up policies and procedures. To ensure good housekeeping, there has to be policies and procedures. Just like in the case of PPE, when there is no enforcement, most workers will tend to be reluctant in putting on the PPE. In the same manner, in a good housekeeping, there has to be a policy or procedure that will be enforced to ensure a good housekeeping. A poor housekeeping will bring about the following. Poor housekeeping will bring about the following: overcrowding, inefficiency, and reduce production rates. Slipping, tripping, and falling, especially when water or oil is being littered on the floor. There will be a case of slip, trip, and fall, and by so doing, injury can be sustained. Damage to equipment. When there is poor housekeeping, there will be damage to equipment. There will be collapse of stack. Falling objects can easily happen in such scenarios. So in conclusion, good housekeeping calls for teamwork. It is the responsibility of all and should not be left for one person. It's a teamwork. It's the responsibility of everyone to ensure good housekeeping. We have come to the end of today's lecture, this class on health, safety, and environment. And now we are going to entertain questions. If you have any question, okay. Let me try and see if you have any question here. It's too tiny. Let's see. Okay. I don't think there's any question here. But if there is, we'll still take it in the next. We'll attend to it in the next class. Thank you so much. See AC David. Thank you.